Hi and welcome to the channel. As many of you know, I put out a survey of 31 movies that I kind of wanted to do for the channel, and I showed the books upon which the movies were based, or else the books that were based on the movies. And I tell you the numbers. Look, there's pages of stuff here where I did things and calculated which of the movies were the choices of you, the people who watch the channel. And I've got it down to 10, and I'm going to be doing them in 3 different videos, and this is the first of those videos, just to cut all of that stuff short. So here's the first 3 of the 10. I'm going to do 3, 3 and 4 and get through the 10, and I may well do some of the other movies later on. Some people have expressed an interest in it. I also didn't prioritize them. If people put the 10 in a particular order, I didn't want to dive down the rabbit hole of calculating which one came first the most and which one came second the most. I just threw them all in, and the ones that got the most votes in people's lists won. And we're going to start off with some good stuff. 2 from the 1970s, 1 from 1980. Thematically, they're sort of linked, though one of them isn't really linked to the others. But they're good, solid films. They are tough, they are classics, with one exception maybe. Gritty as hell, each in their own way. The first one's from 1971, and it's based on a novel called Jack's Coming Home by Ted Lewis, which was renamed after the movie came out. Now here is the one I showed the other week. So the first movie is Get Carter, starring Michael Caine, Ian Hendry, John Osborne, and a whole bunch of incredibly good character actors. In case you were wondering, yes, I am going to ignore the 2000 version of Get Carter starring Sylvester Stallone, because I think that it's kind of pointless to remake this film, because there's nothing at all that requires remaking it apart from somebody trying to cash in on the intellectual property. In the movie, Michael Caine plays Jack Carter, basically a hard man for the London mob, who was originally from the north of England, up around Newcastle, where the movie is mostly filmed, whose brother has died after his car plunged into the river. Jack has questions about that. Now, I'm going to say something controversial about this film, but I'll leave it to the end of the review. We'll get on with the review, and then right at the end I'll tell you what I really think. Jack is kind of living on the edge in London. He's self-medicating with stimulants, he drinks whiskey, and he's having an affair with his boss's girlfriend, played by Britt Ekland. None of those things are going to promote longevity. So the moment Jack hits the north, and you see him travelling by train through the green countryside of the south and into the industrial north. One of the valuable things about this movie is the direction by Mike Hodges gives a documentary look at the north of England as it was in 1971. It had a very different culture than the south. People were working in mines and working in heavy industries, which disappeared in the 1970s and early 1980s thanks to people like Margaret Thatcher. They worked hard, they played hard. Working men's clubs were very popular. There were dance halls and nightclubs and places like that, and it definitely was a different urban culture than you got in other parts of England, and that shows a lot. Jack turns up at the train station and immediately goes into a pub, and within minutes the local mobs have clocked that he's back. He's a well-known hard man. He's a tough guy. People know his brother has just died, and right from the very start they know he's in town, and that makes things really interesting. By the way, if you look at the pub scene at the start of the movie when he arrives in Newcastle, there's a guy drinking beer who has 5 fingers and a thumb. Just a little bit of an Easter egg there. So Jack is clocked by the local mob. So the mob know that Jack's back in town for his brother's funeral, and somebody has arranged for the brother's death. Jack doesn't know why, Jack doesn't know who, but he is determined to find out. He goes to a little bed and breakfast place called Las Vegas, which is an amusing name for a shabby little bed and breakfast, and kind of has an interesting relationship with the landlady there. He also talks to his brother's girlfriend, who is married. Not an unknown thing in the north of England at the time, or anywhere else in the world really. But he talks to her. He talks to his brother's daughter, who's a teenager and who's working in a fast food outlet. Jack meets up with a few people. There's a guy called Keith, played by Alan Armstrong, clues him into what's happening in town. He also has an encounter with the local head of the big mobs in the town, a guy called Kinnear, played by John Osborne, who was better known as a playwright. He wrote plays like Look Back in Anger, for instance, and he's kind of not a professional actor, but he's got a certain saturnine look about him and an understated way of speaking, which makes him quite dangerous. One of the henchmen of Kinnear is a guy called Eric, played by Ian Hendry. Now, Ian Hendry and Michael Caine didn't get on during this movie because Ian Hendry wanted to play Jack Carter. Ian Hendry had been a fairly big star in the UK in the previous decade, but unfortunately his alcoholism was getting the best of him and he died in the 1970s. And his antagonism towards Michael Caine really makes it work that Eric, who is kind of suggested is gay, is kind of a dangerous person to be around. And that gives Michael Caine that beautiful opportunity to say what he thinks Eric's eyes look like: piss holes in snow. There are so many incredible scenes in this film. There's a really interesting scene where Jack asks to use the phone from his landlady, and while she's sitting in a rocking chair, sits down in the sitting room and has phone sex with his girlfriend, played by Britt Ekland, while the landlady is sitting there. And he's doing it partly because he gets off on the idea, and partly because he knows he's going to sleep with the landlady. And that makes things really kind of interesting and shows us that Jack Carter is not a man who plays by normal rules. In fact, apart from the violence in this film, of which there is plenty, there's also a lot of sex in the film as well, which I have forgotten about, which is not really like me. This is such a powerful film. The documentary look of it really lands it. The Newcastle, the town, is, and I've said this before about other movies, but it's really true in this one. One of the characters in the film is this town. It's where working class people live and play hard, and where their people are very tough by the very nature of where they live and the work that they do. And we also get to see the posh people like Kinnear, who are skimming money from the working class people with vending machines and with their nightclubs and with the alcohol they sell them and things like that. So there is definitely a class awareness in Get Carter, which I found really interesting as well. Now, I'm not going to talk about the ending. If you've seen the film, you know the ending. But I love the locations on this, particularly at the back end of the film. We get to see some really interesting 1970s brutalist architecture. We get to see the fact that the whole town basically relies on fossil fuels. There's a disposal mechanism for coal waste, which features very prominently at the end of the film. Many years later, millions and millions of pounds were spent to clean up the mess left by that coal waste. All the beaches near that coal waste depositing thing were polluted with coal and dust and muck, and the cleanup took many years and cost many millions of dollars, which gives the movie a kind of relevance that I find kind of interesting, given the fact that we're now trying to clean up fossil fuels and not pollute the oceans and the waters and things like that. To see how the 20th century handled waste products makes the film just that little more interesting in a way that's not directly related to the narrative. Unforeseen circumstances, let's call it. But this film is great. It's rock solid. It's tough as nails. The story is compelling, and all thanks to Ted Lewis for that. And Michael Caine was miscast. That's the upshot I was going to tell you about. Michael Caine keeps his London accent. His Cockney accent is there. And at the time the movie was made, he justified keeping his own accent by saying that Jack Carter had lived in London for a long time, so he lost his accent. That's not how it happens. if it's someone from the north moves to London and loses their accent, they don't get a Cockney accent, they get received pronunciation, the kind of accent that actors used to have before actors like Michael Caine came along. So I think it's just Michael Caine not wanting to be bothered learning an accent. So that's kind of a weakness for it. The other thing is, you see Michael Caine with his kit off in this film, particularly that scene where he walks out the front door with a shotgun and his dick hanging out. Michael Caine wasn't in fantastic shape. He wasn't fat, but his muscle tone just wasn't there. And Jack Carter is a guy who's supposed to be a hard man. And in fact, there are a couple of lines in the movie which allude to that. Here's my suggestion for an alternate universe if anyone's listening. Get Oliver Reed to play Jack Carter instead of getting Michael Caine to play Jack Carter. Oliver Reed at that stage had that scar down there. He was muscular and bulky. He could play all sides of the character really well. I would love to see an alternate universe Blu-ray of Oliver Reed playing Jack Carter. Now, that isn't to say Michael Caine isn't bad in most aspects of the film. That kind of hooded look he gives people is marvellous. But I would have loved to have seen Oliver Reed play Jack Carter. But that may just be me. Let me know what you think. But just to kind of finalise Jack Carter, it's a classic. I probably want to upgrade to a Blu-ray at some stage rather than just the DVD version. There are a few extras in here as well, but I'm kind of leaning towards, if I've got a few pennies and a Blu-ray of a film of this quality and of this importance in the film comes up, I'm going to buy it. So yeah, get Carter. I do recommend it highly. It's a great, hard, gritty crime drama that of the kind that Brits did really well. And I'm glad the people who watched the channel suggested it. Rated really highly. By the way, in the third video I do in this series, I'm going to be giving everyone the rankings of all the different movies. So I'll save that for the third video. But Get Carter, by the way, there's the back cover of the DVD, which is got to be 20 years old now. But it's still a good transfer, and the movie was riveting all the way through. The last thing I'll mention about the movie is Roy Budd's music for the film is totally on point. Roy Budd did a whole bunch of different movie, particularly action movie soundtracks in the 60s and 70s, and I think he's a very underrated film composer. So let's move on to movie number 2. This one's from 1980, and it was made by Handmade Films, which is George Harrison's production company. Handmade Films produced things like all the Monty Python movies that we know and love. So Handmade Films decided to go out on a limb. They got John Mackenzie to make one of the great British crime dramas. There are a number of really iconic British crime dramas. Brighton Rock comes to mind, and smaller films like Cash on Demand. There are so many of them, and this one is one of the high points of British crime drama. Like I said, it's made in 1980. It's made in Thatcher's Britain, and it is the wonderful and still relevant The Long Good Friday, starring Bob Hoskins, Helen Mirren, Dave King, Brian Marshall, and Eddie Constantine. And this one is, for me, even better than Get Carter. In the movie, Bob Hoskins, in the most iconic role he ever made, plays the guy who runs London's mob, a guy called Harold Shand. Now, Harold is trying to go legit. He's got a plan to renovate a whole bunch of the docks along the Thames River and turn it into a casino and entertainment and housing complex. He needs financing, and he's got a couple of guys coming over from America to help him finance it. They're both from the mafia, and the leader of these two guys, a guy called Charlie, is played by Eddie Constantine. Now, originally it was going to be Anthony Franciosa, but he only stayed a few days, and then he was replaced by Eddie Constantine, who people remember from movies like Alphaville, where he played Lemmy Caution. And Eddie Constantine had made a whole bunch of Lemmy Caution movies in France in the 50s, 60s, and even 1970s. So he had the kind of tough guy thing down pat. Harold's girlfriend Victoria is played by Helen Mirren, and she's a posh girl. She went to school with Princess Anne, as Harold tells us. and she is at least Harold's equal. Now, originally the role was for a kind of dumb blonde, but Helen Mirren talked to John Mackenzie and the production company, and between them they built up the Victoria character in ways that are fantastic. Bob Hoskins was involved in it as well. The director, John Mackenzie, Barry Keefe, the writer, Helen Mirren and Bob Hoskins developed that character in ways that make her really an interesting part of Harold's Good Friday. Things start going wrong unexpectedly. His car gets blown up while he's waiting for his mum outside church on Good Friday morning. A friend of his gets stabbed in a swimming pool, a guy called Colin, who's one of Harold's oldest friends. And things start going wrong in Harold's world. He doesn't know why, though. We kind of have suggestions about why, because there's a long scene before we meet Harold at the start of the film where we see certain transactions taking place, Colin delivering money and things going wrong there. And we get the idea that there's something going on that Harold doesn't know. By the way, Colin is played by Paul Freeman, who played the villain in the original Raiders of the Lost Ark, so there's a bit of a connection there. And the guy who kills him in the movie is played by a young Irish actor in his first film role, a guy called Pierce Brosnan, who had about 3 days work on the film, didn't even get a script to read, just got told what to do, got told he had no lines. He put one line in there for himself, but he still is an important part of this film. So things start going wrong, and Harold starts trying to investigate why. He goes around and finds and engages these corrupt cop friends, engages the other mobs around London, and treats them quite roughly. And as things get worse and worse, Harold really starts to come apart, and his world starts to come apart as well. So everything is going wrong, and Harold doesn't understand. And right up until the last scene of the movie, Harold doesn't fully understand what's going on. Now, I'm not going to do spoilers on what that is, but I think it's crucially important to understand this larger-than-life, fantastic character. Bob Hoskins was never better on the screen than he was in this film. Helen Mirren was really great in the film as well. And that world of 1980 London, where the docks are still run down, migrant groups are coming in, and Harold is a little bit racist as well, which London gangster in 1980, of course he's going to be racist. And Harold doesn't know that somebody in his organisation is doing things behind his back. And that makes for a really interesting film. It moves along so fast, this film. It's about, what's the length of it? It runs 114 minutes, so a little less than 2 hours. But it is tight. There's always something happening. And Bob Hoskins is incredible in this character. The thing I found out yesterday about Bob Hoskins in this role is he just finished, a few months before he finished Zulu Dawn, the sequel to Zulu. He was at a feast and a celebration with some of the extras who were African tribal people, and they got given some raw meat to eat, and Bob Hoskins ended up with a tapeworm 40 feet long in his gut. Apparently it wouldn't die. They gave him medication, the thing wouldn't die, so he eventually had to go in and have an operation to have a 40-foot tapeworm removed from his guts before he made this movie. And after he finished The Long Good Friday, didn't work for a year, got picked up with a whole bunch of things as word of mouth got out among movie makers, but he didn't work for a full year after making The Long Good Friday. Again, the location is definitely one of the characters. Harold on his yacht travelling up and down the Thames, showing Charlie and his sidekick what's going on, having meetings by the waterfront with his corrupt cop friends. The problems he's got are outside Harold's world in a really interesting way. Harold is really proud of England being part of the common market, the European Union, which plays interestingly in a modern context. But the power of this movie is that relationship between Harold and Victoria. It's the fact that the plot just keeps moving on, getting more complicated. I'm going to rewatch this movie in the next few weeks. It is just such a powerful crime film. It may well be one of the great crime films of all time. Made on a relatively limited budget too. They had budgetary constraints as well, which limited what they were able to do. But if you haven't seen Along Good Friday, you should. Arrow Video have put out a fantastic version of it, which I highly recommend because they cleaned up the original. They digitally remastered it, but they also restored it. And there are a ton of extras. You can see there on the back. You can freeze frame that if you like. But there are a ton of extras on this film. And it's just so rock solid. This one's region B locked. So if you don't have a Blu-ray player that's region free, you might have a few problems, but it's worth being in your collection in some form or other. And probably this one's the best copy of it we have so far, unless Criterion have done an edition of it. See this movie, own this movie. This is the first movie based on a novel by Thomas Harris, the guy who later gave us Silence of the Lambs. It's from 1977. There's just been a really good copy of it released, and I believe it is not region locked. It stars Bruce Dern and Robert Shaw and Martha Keller. Black Sunday from 1977. Here's the imprint Blu-ray. I may have shown it on the channel before. There's the back of it. It's got a lot of extras on that as well. And the inside cover is somewhat different there. Now, I don't think this is as good as the other two movies I've talked about this time around. In it, Bruce Dern plays a former Vietnam POW turned blimp pilot who is flying the Goodyear blimp over football games, and the Super Bowl is coming up in Miami, and he has been recruited by Martha Keller's character Dahlia to help them kill thousands of people at the Super Bowl by putting basically a claymore mine the size of a speedboat on the front of the Goodyear blimp. Now, the movie was directed by John Frankenheimer, so his direction on it is really great. It was produced by Robert Evans, and the movie was set up to be the big movie of summer 1977. That didn't happen because George Lucas came in with a childish space opera, which everybody loved, and so this movie got pushed to the wayside, but it's still a solid thriller, and it works. I'm not sure that the idea of having an Irish actor play an Israeli Mossad agent, which Robert Shaw does, really works because his accent's kind of all over the place. It's kind of like a stilted Irish accent in a way. But Robert Shaw's kind of determination is there. 2 years before he was Quint in Jaws, and in the same year, 1977, he played Roma Treese in The Deep, which for me is a fun movie as well. I should do it on the channel at some time in the future, but I'm digressing. So we see this from a couple of different viewpoints. We see the terrorist that starts out in Beirut, where the terrorist compound is attacked by Mossad agents led by Robert Shaw. We also see Bruce Dern's character when he was a POW denouncing the United States and the United States invasion of Vietnam. So we know that he was broken by the North Vietnamese army as it was then. But the film of that was never released to the Americans. The terrorists got a copy of it so they know who the guy is, how much he hates what happened to him when he returned, and how little help he got from the authorities of the Veterans Administration when he got back after 6 years of being a POW. So you can kind of understand where the guy's coming from, even though you know he's as nutty as a fruitcake. But this is Bruce Dern playing crazy, and Bruce Dern playing crazy is always entertaining, though he does give us enough pathos for the character and an understanding where the character is coming from and an understanding of the damage this character has to make him at least as vivid a character as the ostensible heroes, being Robert Shaw's Mossad agent and a whole bunch of Americans helping him, including Fritz Weaver and a bunch of other guys. Now, this isn't Frankenheimer at the peak of his career. He was doing lots of good work at this stage, but people mostly knew him for things like The Manchurian Candidate and the earlier films he did. But it still works out really well. The action is tight. We know where everything is. It's shot really well. Shot mostly on location around Miami. There is some desert shooting as well. for a really interesting scene where they test out their giant claymore mine in an old abandoned airline hangar in the desert. And just to show the audience what the power of this thing is, because not only is it an explosive, there are a whole bunch of steel darts about that big in front of the plastic explosive. So basically anybody within the range of this weapon is going to be torn to shreds. And we get to see a little bit of that before the heroes come to the rescue and all that kind of stuff. It's a solid film. I like what it does, and I like the fact that it's complex about the villains. None of them is a simple character. We do get the backstory of Dahlia and why she was radicalized. We get the backstory about Lander, the Bruce Dern character, and why he is as he is. And we also get the backstory of why Robert Shaw's character has become a leading Mossad agent. They do give the characters enough kind of filmic oxygen so that we understand where they're coming from, even as we find them kind of repugnant. Now, the ending of the film, where inevitably things, let's say, detonate, is kind of weak because the special effects available at that stage weren't good enough to show us what we needed to see. So there are some very quick cuts and even some stop motion model work to demonstrate what's going on with the Goodyear blimp at the Super Bowl. But it's very much an honest action film. I remember seeing it when it came out in cinemas, and I was kind of impressed with it, even though the special effects at the ending were a little bit less than I would have wanted. I still think it works as an action film. It still works as a kind of crime film, and that complexity of character is probably the saving grace of it. I really like the fact that it did things that way. So there are the 3 films that have been chosen by the people who watch the channel. There are going to be 3 more next Saturday, and there are going to be 4 more the 3rd week. So I'm looking forward to talking about those films, because even though some of the films that I wanted to do for this series didn't get the votes, I like the ones that did as well. So there's going to be some fun. I tried to group them into thematic groups, but it's a little difficult to do that for the 2nd and 3rd lot. So they're going to be kind of a slightly random. But it's been a lot of fun revisiting these 3. I'm looking forward to revisiting the next lot. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. You can also donate to the channel for as little as American $1 a month at patreon.com/PaleoCinema. And I am putting up written reviews of movies for the Patreon people only. So if you want to see those written reviews, of which I have 2 at the moment, but I'm putting up maybe 2 a week. I'm hoping to do 2 a week. You can become a patron and see those reviews as well. So anyway, look after yourselves, stay safe, watch some good crime movies, watch some even better crime movies, watch some crime movies that you haven't seen in a while, and I'll catch you next time.